I'm Charlotte Leslie. I'm the Director of CMEC, and I'm speaking to Dr. Ian Ralby about the importance of maritime security. It covers 70% of the Earth. We are dependent on it for 90% of all trade, 20% of all dietary protein intake, and 99% of all telephonic and internet activity. And yet it takes up just a tiny percentage of our collective attention. What is it? It's the sea. My guest today has convincingly argued that our wired-in landlubber perspective, so-called sea blindness, has been fundamental to our inability to effectively tackle the great global issues of our day. So for this podcast, our guest is going to help us turn our eyes seaward, and especially to aspects of activity at sea we don't usually see from our usual land-based habitats. Dr. Ian Ralby has an extensive and impressive CV. In addition to being founder and CEO of IR Consilium, he is the president of Auxilium Worldwide, a charitable not-for-profit that works to support global harmony. He is also a senior fellow at both the Center for Maritime Strategy and the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies. And he's a former adjunct or affiliate of several institutions, including the US Naval War College, the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies, and the Institute for Security Governance. He previously spent 6 years as an adjunct professor of maritime law and security at the US Department of Defense's Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and 5 years as a maritime crime expert for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime's Global Maritime Crime Program. He's worked in more than 90 different countries and is joining us from the US today. Dr. Ian Ralby, welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
First, I'm fascinated by your concept. I know it's not your concept, it's been talked about a bit more, but the concept of sea blindness and how we overlook so much of what goes on simply because we're land-based and the sea is still quite an alien environment. Can you talk me through that a bit more?
Yeah, you mentioned a number of really critical statistics about the importance of the maritime domain to the world. 70% of the earth is covered in water, etc. And it's very hard for us to grasp most of the time how much relevance the maritime space has to life on land. But there's one missing statistic, which I think explains why that is, which is that 100% of people live on land. And so we are incredibly terrestrially focused as a species. And it's now gotten to the extent that we have a better understanding of the near outer space than we do the deep ocean. And so our ability to explore the seas has always been one of the great fascinations of humanity, but it's also been one of the great challenges, and it remains challenging to this day. And so for many of us who don't spend our lives on or around the water, there's a degree of which it is just out of sight, out of mind, and we don't understand it. And so sea blindness has been a pervading concept, even amid island and archipelagic states, where the mindset of the people have turned their backs to the sea and focused entirely on land. You see this in island states where the majority of the police, law enforcement, armed forces are all land-based forces, even though the majority of their territory is actually maritime. And so we have, as a species, a problem of being blind to the majority of the planet. And yet, at this point, our global trade system, our global communication system, all of our financial transactions are occurring on or under the water, and we do not recognize that, we do not pay attention to it, and we do not in any way protect it to the extent that's needed in order to safeguard our life on land. And so what we end up with is criminals who see opportunities, who see vulnerabilities, who see gaps, who see blind spots, are better at exploiting it and understand the wealth in the maritime domain much more than we do. And wealth blindness is a sort of a corollary concept to sea blindness. And so when we talk about world trade happening at sea, we have to remember what that actually means is no shipping, no shopping. And that's true whether you're on the coast or in a doubly landlocked state. The point is that almost everything we get, eat, consume, and use, whether it's energy supplies, food, medicine, clothes, technology, it's been on at least one boat. And that makes it so that we really are dependent on the free flow of maritime commerce and the continued protection of the maritime space for all of our way of life on land.
So I was going to ask, and you answered it for me. I was going to ask, so are the bad guys less sea blind? than we are.
Un Unfortunately, those who understand the wealth of the maritime domain the best are those who would do it harm. And so, whether it's illegal fishing, whether it's piracy, whether it's trafficking, smuggling, theft, terrorism, unfortunately, the bad guys tend to have a drop on us. And this is why we've seen some of the most pernicious maritime activities in terms of crime taking hold and becoming very difficult to counter. The amount of effort it took to push back against a ragtag group of a few Somali pirates or a ragtag group of a few Nigerian pirates made it so that we had to spend billions in countering a couple hundred people. And that is a really important dynamic, and that has been most acute over the last couple of years in the situation involving the Houthis, which have really changed our perspective on the vulnerability of global commerce and the inability of navies to fully safeguard maritime commerce from attacks from land.
I want to come to the Houthis, and because we're the Middle East Council, the Middle East and the Red Sea in particular, in a sec. And this is probably a topic for another podcast, so forgive me for a big question, but I can't resist it. Why is it, do you think, that I'm going to be really Marvel comic simplistic here? The good guys, international rule of law, all the systems and institutions that we set up. Why do you think that it is that we are so bad at seizing opportunity and are so much less entrepreneurial, ambitious, creative in thinking than the bad guys? And then that makes me ask, as I look at the world and the challenges we face, it makes me ask the question, how do you beat the monster without becoming the monster?
Great questions, and I think really relevant to what's happening at the moment. I think there are a couple of problems. Number one, once you create a law or a rule or any kind of line, you then have people who are actively, creatively, intentionally trying to work around it, which makes the protection of it increasingly difficult over time. And as we get further and further in time from making those rules and understanding what underpinned the creation of those rules, we start to forget why they were in place in the first place. And so what ends up happening is that those with the most ingenuity are focused on trying to undermine the rule of law, while those who are supposed to be protecting it are starting to forget why it exists in the first place. And so I think that's where we are globally right now. In the maritime space, though, it's really interesting because there are all kinds of philosophical debates of whether international law exists, given the lack of an ability to enforce it most of the time. The one place that has been true for thousands of years, though, in terms of the existence of international law, has been in the maritime domain. There needs to be a clarity, a certainty, a consistency in how not only do the waters outside of a state's territory, but the waters within states' territories work around the world so that maritime commerce can flow freely, so fishing can happen globally, so that there is universal access to this common heritage of all mankind, which is the 70% of the earth that is covered in water. And so we've had a degree of consistency in not only the development, but the implementation of maritime law. What's changed now is the volume of activity on which we are so reliant on the maritime domain now occurring out of sight and out of mind. And so, as we've downsized navies, as we've downsized law enforcement capacities, as we've reduced the focus on what's happening at sea, and actually advanced our ability to monitor it not from a boat but from a computer terminal, even in a landlocked country. We've kind of changed the thinking about what needs to be done in order to safeguard it. And so criminals have seen that as an opportunity, and unfortunately, the variety of criminals acting has also expanded. And so we've gone from low-level smugglers to non-state armed groups that have armaments that are akin to the highest end militaries, all the way up to the largest militaries in the world being involved in what would be illegal and otherwise illicit conduct. And so the challenge now of protecting and safeguarding the seas and maintaining some of the norms and principles that we've somewhat undermined by forgetting about them is now going to be a pretty stark challenge moving forward. The other point is that with maritime commerce being so visibly the physical side of the global economy, we also are seeing the global economic dynamics shifting literally at sea. And so, we've always had a global legitimate economy and a global illicit economy or black market economy. And unfortunately, we now have a third, which is the global sanctioned economy, because we have sanctioned so many different actors in so many different ways that we've essentially forced almost half of the world into a new trade dynamic where the sanctioned actors and their enablers are able to maintain economic flows outside of everybody else's systems, which means those rules are being made up as we go along. They're changing. And so the universal control of consistency and uniformity in the maritime space is very much at issue and changing as we speak.
Is that what is commonly termed the shadow fleet?
So the Shadow Fleet is definitely part of it, and the Shadow Fleet is the manifestation of this sort of split in the global economy. However, the Shadow Fleet is not the extent of it because there are vessels that are otherwise legitimate that are moving in ways that make it so that economy outside of the global trade regulatory system that we've enjoyed since the end of the Second World War is changing. And so if you look at the BRICS. We see 46% of the world's population in those 11 countries
And that's
that are now
for
part
some viewers, BRICS being Brazil, Russia, Iran, China,
India, China, and
India,
South
sorry, India.
Africa. And now those five have been joined by an additional six states, and more are coming. And that includes Egypt, Iran, Indonesia. So some of the largest countries and the largest developing economies in the world, as well as largest hegemonic economies now, are involved. And with that, some of the largest sanctioned economies. And so what we are seeing is the BRICS system, which also includes Brazil, has now switched on the ability to do payments outside of the dollarized global economic system, which means they're operating outside of the regulatory framework that the U.S. has sort of provided for the world for some time now. And so that off the books, off the dollar, off the global economy transaction system is going to change how world trade happens. And that 46% of the world's population is a very significant trading block that means that we are going to see growth shifts in how vessels move, where vessels move, and how they're able to be monitored and controlled by other states.
So turning now to the region that we cover here at CMEC, the Middle East. I guess the maritime world hit the headlines in a way that it doesn't often do when the Houthis began strikes on commercial shipping in November 2023, I think it was.
Yep.
What was going on before that? Why did the world's attention turn to the maritime entity of the Red Sea at that time? And what's going on now?
It's really interesting you asked the question of what was going on before that because a lot of people don't ask that question. And the fact is, there were maritime attacks that were occurring before. We just hadn't really paid much attention to them. There were sort of three different categories of maritime attacks that were occurring. One was that you still had the legacy of Somali piracy in the Northwest Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden, where yes, since May of 2012, the number of vessels engaged in a legitimate maritime commerce that were actually attacked had gone to almost zero. It was not, however, true that all piracy had gone. The point was that they were just attacking vessels that no one cared about. So either vessels that were engaged in illicit trafficking themselves, so criminal on criminal crime that was outside of everybody's real desire to protect, or against fishing vessels, many of which were engaged again in illicit activity themselves. So there was a maintenance of skills and capabilities that was occurring in the piracy context in the Northwest Indian Ocean. You also had a pretty extensive course of conduct by Iran, where the effort to send particular messages to particular interlocutors was played out through attacks on ships. And those attacks usually occurred in one of three ways. Number one, limpet mines. Number two, drone attacks. And number three, seizure of vessels. The seizures almost always occurred when there was another asset, another interest having been seized somewhere else. So the British took the Grace One off of Gibraltar, and so the Iranians took both the MT Rhea and the MT Stena Impero. So you had two vessels taken in order to use as leverage to get the Grace One released. And so that kind of tit for tat back and forth, exchange was something that the Iranians had in place for a while. But the third bucket, in addition to the Somalis and the Iranians, was the Houthis themselves. They attacked a number of ships throughout the course of the Civil War from 2014 onward, where people just didn't pay any attention, partly because the ships that were being attacked were part of the wider issue and context of the conflict. But there were signs that this was coming. They attacked quite a few different tankers. They attacked oil terminals at sea. They attacked, or they piloted rather, technology that ended up leading to piers being blown up and other things that were occurring. And so the advancement of the capacity of the Houthis to attack vessels at sea was being sort of tested at least as early as 2016, maybe even earlier. And so we'd seen already a lead up to November 19th, 2023, when they spectacularly seized the Galaxy leader. And I think what made that different was that they understood that they needed to show, not just tell, what was going on and do it in as visible and spectacular way as possible. And so their media campaign, their information operation has always been pretty impressive, particularly with regard to the people they're targeting, so their own regional actors. But the video of that boarding and seizure of that vessel was globally witnessed as being a mark in the sand in terms of, okay, things are different now. This isn't just tit for tat inside of a wider context of a civil war. This is fundamentally different. And so since then, we have seen the largest non-state actor assault on maritime commerce ever. That was the only vessel that they really tried to seize. Everything else since then have been attacks. They've sunk quite a few vessels. The most recent attacks have all been pretty spectacular in their blowing up and sinking of vessels, even taking of hostages. So the Houthis are different than anything else we've ever seen in terms of their capacity to inflict force against global maritime commerce and do so in a way that fundamentally changed trade routes.
But it's not only trade routes. I was fascinated by this because you saw overnight they became a political entity, particularly, post the terror attack of October the 7th. They became the defenders of the Palestinians, we're doing what the rest of the world isn't doing. It was a hugely strong political narrative that was launched through that maritime attack, which did resonate here in the West.
Right, and I think the sad reality is that because nobody had paid enough attention to who they were or what they were after before the 19th of November 2023, everyone bought that false narrative. And so we allowed them to control the narrative of their own actions rather than recognizing the truth of it, which was that they were opportunistic. They were jumping on the Palestinian cause. They were also jumping on the reality that as long as Israel continued to attack Gaza, they were safe from anyone else interfering with them in the region, because nobody would want to stop the Houthis protesting Israel, lest it be seen as doing something to help Israel. And so the dynamics were brilliantly sort of mechanized by the Houthis in order to put the West in the position of buying their narrative and put both the Palestinians and the Israelis in a position to safeguard their position and advance their cause for quite a while. They're now looking at what's next, and that is a scary thing. But politically, they got huge visibility, support, money, momentum, credibility. And with regard to their own false narratives internally, they've been saying that they were at war with the US and the UK for years. And all of a sudden it was true. Every headline in the world confirmed it. They said that they were at war with Israel for years. And all of a sudden the Israelis confirmed it. And so this last few years has been sort of a heyday for the Houthis. And while many say, but they've been bombed so extensively by the Americans, by the Israelis, by others, ask the Saudis, who had been bombing them for years prior. The Houthis don't mind being bombed. Yes, every once in a while somebody gets taken out that they don't like having dead, but they don't have the same regard for human life that the rest of the world does, nor do they see bombing as necessarily a bad thing. It means they're relevant. And so they are bizarrely energized by the attacks. And so right now things have been kind of quiet for them, and so not surprisingly, we're seeing a re-enlivening of their desire and need for some global attention and relevance, especially after regrouping following a series of attacks that did set them back, and the loss of the convenient narrative that they'd been coasting on for a couple of years.
Staying with Yemen, and I'm not sure to what extent this links in with what we're already talking about. You've seen other action at sea involving tankers in shipments from the UAE to support the Southern Transitional Council in its bid for independence. What do you make of that, and what role has
Well,
maritime had to play in that, and where do you see that more broadly?
I think over the last few months, the last 6 months or so, we've seen a shift in some of the attention of government of Yemen actors as well as others around Yemen, recognizing that perhaps the quiet time with the Houthis is an opportunity to reestablish some of the sovereign control within Yemen's territory overall. The challenge is that these external actors, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and to a certain extent, Iran still as well, have all sort of been shown to be shipping arms and other supplies to different competing groups. Um, the last couple of weeks have been chaotic in terms of the governance picture within the government of Yemen held territory. The STC, the Southern Transitional Council, has disbanded. We've now seen this weird shift. The Emiratis are kicked out. The retreat to Somaliland across the Red Sea, in terms of Emirati focus and some of the key figures from the STC, has led to a revived focus by the Houthis on Somaliland and cross Red Sea dynamics. And so over the last few days, just within the last week, we've seen Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the Houthi leader, talk about needing to start striking sites inside of Somaliland because that coincides as well with Israel's being the first country in the world to recognize Somaliland as an independent state. And so we have a real bust up of some of what had been, albeit unhelpful and unhealthy relations, stable relations for the last few years since the April 2022 truce. And so there was a real bust up over the last few weeks in terms of just how that is likely to play out. And the Houthis remain a wild card because they are undoubtedly still moving. I mean, they're not going to give up. We're not going to see the end of the Houthis just because a couple of port infrastructure sites or even secret sites got bombed. They're going to be continuing to figure out how to regroup and keep going as long as they have breath and blood. So there's a real chance for renewed volatility, but cross Red Sea volatility now, because some of these regional and extra regional actors are becoming more involved in the internal dynamics, not just with regard to the Houthis, but other places in the near area as well, including the government of Yemen territory.
To what extent are the Houthis operating, collaborating in alliances with, say, Al-Shabaab in Somalia? Is that growing?
We've seen a lot of evidence that suggests that it is a pretty clear connection now. The Houthis, for a lot of the last year, really have been focusing on building alliances. They kind of got to the point where they felt they were the big boy in the region. They were at the big table. They were a hegemon of their own. They were more true than the Iranians in terms of defenders of the faith because the Iranians gave up their positions in Syria. And so all of a sudden, the Russian attention towards the Houthis got them to feel a lot more like they were the big dog. And so what that led to was the formation of new alliances and relationships with Al-Shabaab, with Islamic resistance, with other groups in the area, both state and non-state, that they felt they could leverage in the longer term. And there is a lot of goodwill towards the Houthis for those who see them as having been protesting Israel incursion into Gaza. And so there's a very dynamic situation that could change almost overnight in a lot of places if the Houthis were to really enliven that. And what we've seen is that weapons that had historically flowed from Somalia into Yemen started flowing from Yemen into Somalia in order to arm some of the militant groups, and that dynamic with Somaliland has really kicked up in the last few weeks, and that is going to be a flashpoint of tension again at the mouth of the Bab al-Mandeb, and so a very challenging time ahead for the entrance to the Red Sea.
I'm Charlotte Leslie. I'm the director of CMEC, and I'm speaking to Dr. Ian Ralby about the importance of maritime security. Ian, we've talked about sea blindness. I know that some people listening and those who I talk with on a daily basis would say there's also something else called Sudan blindness.
Very much.
massive, massive scale of atrocities going on.
Yeah.
Also, enormous geopolitical significance as well, and we don't seem to be talking about it. Can we shift our focus there and continuing our maritime theme, the importance of the port of Sudan in amongst the atrocities that are taking place?
Well, I think there's a really smooth transition because one of the things I just mentioned was Russia's interest in the Houthis was partly born of an inaccessibility to Port Sudan as the sort of future of their Red Sea base for a while. The Russian dynamic in Sudan is really important to mention at the outset because Sudan would not be in quite the mess it's in without some of the external actors we've already discussed. Russia and the UAE in particular have both had huge roles in stoking some of the tensions that have led to the brutal civil war that has occupied the country over the last 2 years in particular, and which has displaced more people than any other country on earth. It's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. And as you say, it's getting almost no attention. And it's really quite sad that the sort of black holes of our attention, including Yemen for years, led to us not being prepared for something that spilled way past Yemen's borders to threaten maritime commerce. And we're seeing a similar dynamic in Sudan, where a lot of the Red Sea coast on the southern side is amid a conflict that is hard to believe just how brutal, how awful it is. When satellite imagery is able to spot the blood spilled from some of the massacres, you know that this is not your usual spat. It's a really brutal conflict that is going to leave historic scars. And so we really have to start spending more attention focusing on what is going on inside of Sudan in order to understand how critical that is, not just for the region but for the world. I mean, there's a huge amount of geopolitical significance to what is going on because not only does it matter for humanity, but it also matters for the funding and financing of other places. We see between oil and gold and the movement of weapons a dynamic that is much larger than Sudan itself, and Port Sudan is that linchpin. The Russians have wanted, throughout Russian history, there's been a desire for warm water ports. In the Red Sea, we already have the U.S., the French, the British through the U.S. and the Chinese having basing access in Djibouti, and then the Russians, the only remaining party of the P5 of the UN Security Council, have been gunning for a Port Sudan naval base for years. Having lost a lot of their access in Syria and the base at Tartus, they're very, very keen on something in the Red Sea now, and that means that they have been stoking all kinds of different things for years. In fact, the current conflict could be drawn in part to when the U.S. encouraged the democratically elected government of Sudan to reject the Russian bid for the Port Sudan base. The Russian elements helped stoke some of the tensions that led to the RSF fighting against the army and creating this incredible humanitarian catastrophe. So there are a lot of dynamics there, and a lot of them are tied to the sea.
What is the strategic importance if you are able to park the humanitarian atrocities, which I think is very difficult to do, and we shouldn't, but if we're looking simply strategically for the West, for the UK, for Western nations who have tended to stay well away from Sudan, not want to pick a winner, talk about humanitarian alleviation of horrors, but not really want to get involved. What's at stake with the Port of Sudan? What's its strategic importance?
Well, the prior to November 2023, 30% of all containerized cargo went through the Red Sea, 30% globally. That means all our goods, the stuff that we use. So 10% of global energy cargoes went through there. A huge amount of bulk goods, so food, etc. also. And what we're seeing now is that has been reduced dramatically because of the Houthi attacks. There's a desire to bring that back and alleviate some of the economic tensions, particularly on Europe, from having the cost go up for ships to go all the way around Africa and to increase the insurance premiums going through the Red Sea. But there's more to it than just that. If you look at the Suez Canal, it is a huge contributor to the Egyptian economy. They get about nine and a half prior to the Houthi attacks. They got about $9.5 billion in direct revenue and about $52 billion in indirect revenue from the canal. That is down 60%. That decrease is absolutely critical to the survival of the Egyptian economy. If Egypt collapses, the result for the wider Mediterranean region is enormous. And so what we're looking at a number of knock-on consequences from these critical choke points being inaccessible or from having them be not as heavily traversed. And so the geostrategic significance of the Red Sea remains huge. And so we have to look at what the long-term projections are for the economy, for supply chains, for access to goods, for access to food, for access to energy, as well as for the ability of some of the coastal states to survive. Djibouti's food supply is incredibly important to the food supply of the entire Horn. So the humanitarian situation in Sudan is also relevant to being able to access those goods. And so as dominoes start to fall in terms of governance, we end up with greater and greater chaos, and unfortunately, bad actors tend to proliferate and take advantage of chaos more than the good. The good tend to flap, and so we're seeing a lot of flapping right now, and unfortunately, that means that there's a lot of nefarious activity that is taking hold. And one of the most nefarious activities that takes hold is resource grab. So where there's a diminution in governance, there tends to be a lot of looting. Looting can be at the local level from retail stores, or it can be at a global scale in terms of gold and oil and minerals. And that's what we're seeing more of. And so the states that are benefiting most from the resource looting of Sudan and some of the neighboring states which are similarly experiencing instability, they're getting stronger and stronger in terms of their gold reserves, in terms of their access to critical minerals, in terms of their access to oil supplies. And the result is that that dynamic that we talked about at the beginning of a split in the global economy from a sort of Bretton Woods system to a tripartite economy of the global legitimate, the global illicit, and the global sanctioned is starting to occur more rapidly. The sanctioned actors are those who have the best access to the gold, and they also almost all happen to be BRICS members. So when Russia, the UAE, when Iran all start to stockpile gold, and none more so than China, we end up with a situation where the de-dollarization of the global economy, the breaking of all the financial regulations that have become a stabilizing factor for global trade, it's a very realistic possibility.
I remember talking to people about the possibility of de-dollarization just a few years ago and being laughed out of the room.
Yeah. And now it's not only realistic. So we have a tendency to not believe some of the crazy things that come out of Moscow or Beijing or elsewhere until they actually happen. And so, China has been pretty candid in saying what it's going to do for the last quarter century. And now that it's done it, we're all shocked. Russia has a history of saying what it's going to do, and then we're surprised when they actually go and do it. And so our unwillingness to entertain the possibilities and safeguard ourselves against the likelihood of the craziest things from actually occurring means that we are constantly getting caught off guard, and that's going to put us behind. In some cases, perhaps intractably behind. In other words, we are setting ourselves up for having to cope with a significant change in the world order, the world economic order, the world trade order, and we're not ready for it.
Yeah, the folly of confusing the present with the permanent.
Exactly.
So, talking of crazy and crazy
Mhm.
times and unexpected things, Trump, Venezuela, Iranian tankers, I think what it brought home to quite a few people is that regional politics in the region isn't geographically confined.
Yeah.
You can have Iranian, Middle Eastern oil politics going on off the coast of South America. What's the implications of that, and what's your readout on what's going to be happening?
Well, it's very interesting. I'll speak to it from a maritime standpoint in particular because the last few weeks have shown us that there may be a new trend and a new approach to safeguarding illicit or sanctioned cargoes. For the last several years, Iran has tried to keep its tanker fleet as dark as possible and as invisible as possible. In other words, their effort for years under heavy sanctions to continue to survive economically has relied on the ability of tankers to move undetected and provide access to the global economy, and particularly to the Chinese marketplace, for the continued flow of Iranian oil to an end buyer. The Russians, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, have similarly had to shift how they move their energy cargoes, which again is the backbone of their economy. And so what we've seen is this quote unquote shadow fleet or dark fleet or ghost fleet, rogue fleet. I've heard so many different colloquial terms applied to it. But what it essentially describes is a phenomenon where you have poorly maintained vessels that are operating with some degree of sanctioned activity, whether it's the vessel itself, the cargo, the owner, or some dynamic within it being sanctioned. And then that leads to sort of the flagging in jurisdictions that are perhaps less likely to impose any kind of regulations, including regulations for safety standards, for environmental standards, for insurance requirements, etc. And so we've seen this poorly operated, poorly maintained, basically unregulated fleet taking the Russian and Iranian and Venezuelan and North Korean cargoes to different parts of the world. And so what that has led to is a consternation around what could be done and how to stop them. And we've seen some of those vessels involved in anchor dragging in order to cut cables in the Baltic and elsewhere. The whole thing has become a challenge because they've essentially put themselves outside of any regulatory space that we're accustomed to. The maritime domain relies on the flag of the vessel being willing to take responsibility for that vessel. And when the jurisdictions into which they're flagged either don't know those vessels are being flagged there because they're being done so fraudulently, or don't actually operate a registry at all, so it's being completely done fraudulently, then we've got a situation where you have these unregulated actors operating on the high seas without any kind of clear, a consistent approach for how to deal with them. What has occurred in the last few weeks with the United States aggressively pursuing unilaterally sanctioned tankers, so tankers not under UN sanctions but under US sanctions, outside of US territory, which is generally frowned upon, is that they've taken advantage of the very clear authorization under international law to board vessels that have unclear or clearly fraudulent flag registries. Stateless vessels or vessels without nationality can be boarded anywhere outside of 12 nautical miles. So the boarding of any of these vessels, I have no problem with. The problem comes in as what are they going to do with them after they're on board? So the seizures remain to be seen in terms of the legality, in terms of what theories were being used. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is actually Russia's response. So since 2022, the Russians and the Iranians both have really sought not to flag anything in Russia or Iran because that put a target on their back, basically. But all of a sudden, we've seen what was a clearly stateless vessel, the Bella One, mid-journey in the Atlantic, reflag itself into Russia. And Russia not only take genuine responsibility for it as a Russian flagged vessel, but provide it with a military escort involving both a surface asset and a submarine. That's a difference. And so when the Marinera was boarded, what we saw was perhaps a shift in some of the dynamics involving flagging, where we may see some of the shadow fleet reflag back into Russia, back into Iran. And Iranian vessels have suddenly turned on their AIS transponders, the automatic identification system, which allows them to be tracked. And so we're starting to see this ghost fleet or shadow fleet or dark fleet get lit up with Iranian and Russian flags on them. So they may be setting up both an opportunity to go after the United States for unlawful seizure in the future, or setting up the possibility of a state-on-state conflict between the American forces and in the case of the Bella One or Marinera, British forces as well, and the Russian Federation military. So that is a concerning trend, which makes it actually more difficult in some ways to go after some of these. And if they're legitimately flagged in a genuine flag state, it makes some of the boardings a lot more challenging.
Finally, in your work, you're dealing for the large part of your work with an area of the world, 70% of it, which the political class don't look at that much.
Yeah.
That must be very frustrating. What is it that we could do? And I speak as a former elected person myself. What is it that us lot can do to focus on this more? Are there institutional changes we can make, rearrange some structures? How can
I'd say there are three things. Number one, I think every politician, whether you are from a coastal constituency or even a landlocked constituency or a landlocked state, need to understand the maritime space. And so getting briefings from people who actually know what they're talking about is really important. And one of the challenges, though, with that is that I've seen posts on LinkedIn just in the last 24 hours that literally, I mean, they were paragraphs long, and every single sentence was just flat, grossly wrong. And so part of the problem is there's a huge degree of armchair expertise that seems to be coming out of the woodwork. All of a sudden, I've spent my career wondering where all the maritime experts were, and now they all seem to be on LinkedIn saying things that don't make any sense. But getting genuine briefings from people who actually know what they're talking about is really important. Number two, there needs to be a public discourse around this. There needs to be an effort to recognize that, hey, go into your closet and look at the label on every single item in your closet. See how many things have actually been made in the country where you are right now. And the reality is that most of what we consume, most of what we use, most of what surrounds us actually has come on a boat. And once you start to get that, and then start to realize that this very Zoom call, every phone call, every bank transaction that you do remotely is all done through the submarine cables that sit beneath the ocean. You start to realize that, hold on a minute, that 70% of the earth is actually hugely impactful on my day-to-day life. If I can't stream Netflix, and if I can't do bank transfers, if I can't, call or WhatsApp or signal message or send a message on Facebook or Instagram or anything else without the submarine cables, my life is very different. And so when we start to realize the significance of the maritime domain to life on land, that helps generate some of the political will, because fundamentally, as a politician, I'm sure you will recognize this, it's hard to spend your time and energy focused on an area where no voters live. And so the democratic reality of that statistic I mentioned at the beginning, that 100% of people live on land, is really, really tough to overcome. But once we start to see that nexus of the wealth of our life on land being entirely dependent on the maritime domain, we start to get a little bit closer. And the last thing is something that I think every country in the world should consider, which is to appoint an ambassador at large for maritime affairs. One of the challenges that we have is that diplomatically, we need to be working with every other flag state, coastal state. Some of those flag states are landlocked. Mongolia is a major flag state, has no coastline. So the ambassador at large needs to not be a geographic phenomenon, but a conceptual phenomenon where they actually have the background in maritime law, security, trade, ports, etc., and understand at least some of the infrastructure, and have a small staff that can help them on any of the areas they're not in some way familiar or expert. But they can then engage with others to actually work some of these issues out. If your first interaction about a maritime issue has to involve a briefing on understanding the difference between the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf, and the high seas and beyond, that's not a very good starting point for having a meaningful discussion of a critical issue. So when the Ever Given gets stuck in the Suez Canal, when the Beirut blast happens, when the oil spill off Mauritius happens, when the Baltimore Bridge goes down, when the Houthis start attacking, when the pirates in call it the Northwest Indian Ocean, Nigeria, Caribbean, elsewhere start attacking, when trafficking vessels start getting blown up, when tankers start getting seized, you don't want to be Googling what the law might be when you're the one that is supposed to be dealing with the issue. And so we've seen a lot of unfortunate statements from political officials who just, not to any fault of their own, have no background in this esoteric world that does cover 70% of the world's surface and 90% of all our trade and all our goods. And so we need to make sure that experts are at least somewhere in the mix to both educate and also be involved in some of the diplomatic dynamics that are quite complicated.
It's the huge amounts of the human body is water, and it sounds like a large percentage of the human politics is as well.
Yeah.
Dr. Ian Ralby, thank you for at least informing us to some extent about what's going on in the 70% of the world, which we're not really looking at. You've been fantastic, and hopefully we can speak to you again in due course. Thank you very, very much indeed.
My pleasure. I always look forward to it.
Thank you.